Just a few miles southwest of Washington, D.C., America's political heart, lies Arlington National Cemetery. Thousands of men and women who fought to make America the land of the free lie here. Soldiers, pioneers, and presidents. Arlington is their final resting place, but their stories began in every part of the world.
Many of the veterans who rest here at Arlington share a unique European heritage, whose seeds were sown in Scotland, nurtured in the north of Ireland, and came to fruition in America. That heritage is the Scots-Irish, a culture that has had enormous impact here in the United States. And yet the most incredible thing about the Scots-Irish is how few in today's Scotland, Ireland, or America know anything about them.
So I'm on a mission to set the record straight. This is the story of the Scots-Irish, a unique people who fought for independence in the wilds of Scotland, battled for their faith and recognition in the north of Ireland, scorned aristocracy and helped win the American Revolution, and found in the United States that they could brave all frontiers, even those that are out of this world.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The values, culture, and fighting spirit of the Scots-Irish have profoundly shaped America, so it's vital that we understand more about this people. Where did the Scots-Irish come from? Why did they have to battle so hard for liberty? How have their values shaped America? And why was this unique people born fighting?
Arlington National Cemetery, the resting place of heroes. I have many friends buried here, as well as others whom I greatly admire and respect. In 1997, my brother stood nearby, shivering in a kilt, playing Scotland the Brave and then Amazing Grace on his bagpipes as we buried our father. My father had never set foot in Scotland, but the music, as with the heritage itself, had been passed down to us through the generations, and we decided that this was the best way to honor him.
My family has a military heritage. It's Scots-Irish to the core. My father served in World War II in the Berlin Airlift. My time came in Vietnam. My son had hard combat in Iraq. Our traditions of fighting for freedom and fairness have been passed down from father to son, not just through the generations, but through the centuries. These are Scots-Irish traditions, time-tested on the harsh soil of 1,000 battlefields. Like Scotland itself, this people who would so struggle in Ireland and transform America was born fighting. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the mighty Roman Empire's troops were stopped in their march through Britain by fierce northern warriors. Unable to conquer these tribes, the Emperor Hadrian built a vast wall to stop them from attacking his southern territories. Stretching for 73 miles across the neck of Britain, the wall was the first border separating lands that became known as Scotland and England.
Hadrian's Wall more or less left the Scots to their own devices. Culturally it's isolated, politically it's isolated, economically it's isolated. Not in a bad sense necessarily, but they're allowed to develop on their own without interference from outside.
Cut off from the south, the sea surrounding ancient Scotland brought her closer to her western neighbor, Ireland.
This stretch of water between Scotland and the north of Ireland is less than 20 miles across. I can actually see the Irish coast without binoculars standing right here. For thousands of years, this channel has been viewed more as a road than as a barrier.
Today we think about inland communication as the quick thing and seaborne travel as the slow thing. In this period, it's the other way around.
Just like today, there was constant trade across this channel of ideas, goods, and even religion. Most importantly, the people living on both shores mixed freely.
John, safe journey!
More than 1,500 years ago, a tribe called the Gaels came over from Ireland and established a kingdom here in western Scotland. The Romans called these warriors the Scotti, which is where the name Scotland comes from.
The Scotti tribe's kingdom solidified the links between modern-day Northern Ireland and Scotland. Some historians describe it as the first mass migration between the two lands. It would not be the last. Over the passing centuries, Scotland's geographic boundaries helped form it into a nation. It remained resolutely Celtic in character, more connected to Ireland than to England. In the 13th century, King Edward I of England decided to change all that. He wanted Scotland, and he was ruthless in destroying anyone who tried to stop him. Every Scottish schoolchild knows that in her hour of need, a hero stepped forward to save Scotland. This monument was built to honor him. William Wallace, a truly brave-hearted warrior. William Wallace is such an important figure to Scottish history that it's difficult to know where mythology ends and the truth begins. But we do know that he was a great tribal leader, a shrewd tactician, and one of the first commoners in modern history to lead a national uprising. In England, it was unthinkable that people would unite under a commoner like Wallace.
Wallace's great achievement was to be able to galvanise the Scottish support, the common army, if you like, into fighting on behalf of an ideal, the freedom of Scotland. That was his amazing, amazing achievement.
Edward thought the Scots would be a pushover. What he got was a lesson in freedom fighting. At Stirling Bridge in 1297, Wallace gathered his army of ordinary, proud Scotsmen. Desperately outnumbered, they fought for their independence. Their descendants in the north of Ireland and on the American frontier would echo the same battle cries. And at Stirling Bridge, their resolve won the day for Wallace.
This was the battle that sent people all over Europe looking at their atlases. Where on earth is Scotland? Who are these people who have defeated the might of England, the greatest feudal army in Europe at this time? But Wallace pulled it off by a magic which some generals have and some don't.
Wallace became a Scottish hero, an English public enemy #1. 8 years later, in 1305, he was captured, then hanged, drawn, and quartered. Resolute to the end, in defeat, Wallace found victory. He had shown those in control that the fiercely independent Scottish people would bend the knee to no authority they did not respect. With Wallace gone, the English again tried to conquer Scotland. But in Robert the Bruce, Scotland had a new flag bearer for freedom. In 1314, Bruce brought his army to a battlefield outside Stirling, now known as Bannockburn, to fight Edward II, the new English king. I've come to Bannockburn to meet Tony Pollard and learn why this battle is so key in the story of the Scots-Irish.
Bruce is outnumbered. Bruce's army, maybe 7,000 to 10,000, so perhaps even half as many as the English army. And he knew from the years of experience that if he fought in the open, in the normal chivalrous manner, night against night, he was going to lose. So he uses guerrilla tactics to fight a very sort of hit-and-run campaign.
On Midsummer's Morning 1314, Bruce surprised Edward and trapped his forces between two small rivers.
Bruce very cleverly has turned Edward's army into its own worst enemy. It can't maneuver, and men are killed in the crush and the press. Men are falling into the stream, and it's said that you could walk dry shod over the dead bodies over the stream itself. So what you have at Bannockburn is an absolute defeat for the English and ultimate victory for the Scots.
And the formation of Scotland as an independent nation?
Undoubtedly, yeah. This is a key moment in Scotland's history.
The victories by Wallace and Bruce reaffirmed Scottish independence and led to a groundbreaking pronouncement. In 1320, Scotland's leaders signed a treaty demanding international acceptance of Bruce as king, the Declaration of Arbroath.
For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we, on any conditions, be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. The Treaty of Arbroath sounds eerily familiar. It was Scotland's Declaration of Independence, nearly 500 years before that of the United States.
The Declaration of Arbroath of 1320 is one of the most powerful documents in European medieval history. If a monarch of Scotland subjected himself to English rule, then it would be legitimate for that monarch to be removed, and that had a very powerful impact on later periods of history that I think also went into the American colonies and played a role in the establishment of American independence.
Scotland's geography had helped create its independence. Its politics were now developing its democratic spirit. And there was one final ingredient that transformed the Scots into the fiery free thinkers who would alter the character of the north of Ireland and ultimately America.
Scots found a new way to worship God, and we're still reeling from it.
Edinburgh is renowned today for hosting the world's biggest arts festival, but in the 16th century it was radical religious speakers who were drawing the crowds. For centuries, all Western European Christians had followed one religion, Catholicism. But corruption was rife in Scotland's Catholic Church.
Supposedly celibate people having babies, bishops who really weren't religious at all, people being put in as archbishop because they were perhaps the illegitimate son of someone important who needed a job.
Most Scots needed little encouragement to leave the Roman Catholic Church. And one fiery preacher grabbed their imagination.
In 1559, John Knox gave a sermon here at St. Giles Church that didn't beat about the holy bush. He preached that all people were equal in the eyes of God, and that Christ, not the Pope, not the bishops, not the king, but Christ alone was the only authority to be answered to. In one fell swoop, Knox ripped away the church hierarchy and placed the ordinary person face to face with God and eye to eye with his leaders. From now on, only a person's individual conscience would be their guide. This was heady stuff.
Knox's message lit a fire underneath the Scottish Reformation, and most Scots embraced the new faith. This fundamentalist Christianity transformed their lives. The people now control their own churches or kirks, rather than the bishops and the Pope. The congregation chose their ministers, and their elders in the kirk session had a say in how he performed his duties.
The radical teachings of Knox and like-minded Protestants had a profound impact on the lives of ordinary Scots. They were educated so that they could read the words of the Bible themselves. And so this religious transformation had profound social impacts.
Education opened up people's thoughts. Parishes became independent, keeping the money they used to send to Rome. And the right to choose their own religious leaders gave the ordinary people a taste of democratic ideas. This religion and attitude would eventually dominate America's Bible Belt. And in the early 1600s, Knox's radical ideas fused with William Wallace's ancient battle cry for freedom to create a unique Scottish identity.
I think the crucial thing for Scotland and the Protestant Reformation is that Protestantism becomes allied, associated with Scottish national identity, with Scottish patriotism.
And thousands of these Scottish patriots were about to export this unique heritage, lock, stock, and barrel, to neighboring Ireland. To understand why they left, we need to start at the very top with the king himself. In 1603, James VI of Scotland also became King of England and Ireland. He saw his new Irish kingdom as trouble.
James's view of the Irish couldn't have been more contemptuous. He thought they were barbarous, uncivilized, horribly Catholic, and also extremely expensive.
King James may have been wrong on some fronts, but Ireland was expensive. The northern province of Ulster was in constant turmoil, requiring James to keep an army there. But in 1603, a fellow Scotsman came up with a way of saving money on the army. Give some of the Catholic Irish lands over to Scottish Protestant settlers. Scottish Lord Hugh Montgomery was an associate of King James. In 1603, Montgomery had problems with his estate here on Scotland's west coast. Too many people, too little land, and too little income. Then, an unusual opportunity arose across the Channel in the Ulster town of Carrickfergus. Today, Carrickfergus is an easygoing seaside town 10 miles north of Belfast, but in the 17th century, it was a stronghold of English control in Ireland. This castle was a formidable jail, housing anyone who angered the English authorities. And that's how Con O'Neill, an Irish tribal chief, found himself on death row. In 1603, legendary Irish chieftain Con O'Neill was imprisoned in this cell, waiting to be executed for acts against the English crown. So his wife approached Hugh Montgomery and made him a daring offer. If he could save her husband's life, O'Neill would give him half his lands. Montgomery was a businessman. He scooped that offer up in a heartbeat. And in that one moment, the future of Ulster, Scotland, and the United States took a different course. Freeing Con O'Neill was pretty straightforward. Legend has it that one of Montgomery's men romanced the jailer's daughter and then smuggled in escape ropes. Having freed O'Neill, Montgomery then persuaded King James to pardon the Irish chief, and O'Neill responded by handing over thousands of acres of Irish land.
This agreement may have been informal and possibly suspect, but it marked the beginning of what we now call the Plantation of Ulster.
In May 1606, the first wave of Montgomery's Scottish settlers arrived in Ulster, and the strength of these new communities inspired King James. He saw in Montgomery's example a way to turn Ulster from Catholic to Protestant, and to make some money in the process. James could divide Ulster up and lease plots out to Crown-approved landlords. These landlords would then bring in Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. And the king expected that the loyal Protestant communities would stabilize Ulster.
Establishing the Protestant Reformation is part of the process of civilizing Ulster. This is seen by James as a barbarous place, and he wants to civilize it through godly Protestant immigrants from Scotland and from England. And that's really part of the process of making the Reformation effective in 17th century Ireland.
Implementing this concept would require the complete overhaul of Ulster. But as these maps held here in Northern Ireland's Public Record Office show, King James was the consummate town planner. These maps from nearly 400 years ago are exquisite in their detail. Order would be imposed in Ulster from above. The guilds of London laid out business areas, farm plots, roads, and bridges. The towns were built, but order never came. From the very beginning, the plantation of Ulster was bitterly divisive. The native Irish were being forced off their own ancestral lands.
But the incoming Scottish settlers also would suffer restrictions from the plantation hierarchy. Many in Northern Ireland believe that these conscious divisions are the cause of their recent troubles.
The idea behind the plantation was a strict separation of the Protestant English and Scots from the Catholic Irish. But that was never feasible, and tensions among these groups were inevitable. Most of the Catholic Irish refused to leave their homeland, and their fierce fighting abilities deterred many potential settlers. But James knew there was one group he could count on to come, their Celtic cousins, the Scots. He wrote,
"The Scots are a middle temper between the English tender breeding and the Irish rude breeding, and are a great deal more likely to adventure to plant Ulster than the English."
There were good reasons for the lowland Scots to take up James's offer. Fast-rising rents were crippling small farmers, and overpopulation was causing famines. Ulster offered escape and possibilities.
It's important to realise that people who left could be called entrepreneurs, looking at Ulster as a land of opportunity, where a new life could be developed.
Ochiltree, a small town south of Glasgow, was a typical recruiting ground for settlers.
It's an emotional feeling to be walking among these graves at Ochiltree and Ayrshire here in the Scottish lowlands. Some of them have the names of my own family. The McKnights over here, the Millers over there. Other stones are unreadable, the names washed away by time. In the 1600s, entire families who had been here for generations moved across the water to the north of Ireland. There was no one left to tend these graves. They were simply the people they left behind.
The exodus from Ochiltree was repeated across lowland Scotland as families risked everything to establish a better life in Ulster.
That brave or desperate decision changed the course of history.
Their Scottish values would be hardened in Ulster: independence, equality, freedom of worship. And 150 years later, these ideals would help create American democracy. But it wasn't just farmers and preachers who made the trip. A third group who accompanied them would add a mix of wildness to the unique Scots-Irish character: the borderers. The people living along the frontiers of Scotland were as wild as any of their descendants on the frontiers of the American West.
If ever there were a people born fighting, it was the borderers. For centuries after William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, they lived a turbulent lifestyle. Plundering, killing, maiming, cattle rustling. The violence of their lifestyle led many of them to be called reivers, or robbers. And in this lawless land, they indeed were a law unto themselves. The culture of these men and women was different from the rest of Low and Central Scotland. They showed no allegiance to any crown, only to their clan, and would fight to the death for their kinsmen. Family feuds, once begun, could continue for generations. Sounds a little bit like East Kentucky or West Virginia.
For centuries, the monarchs of Scotland and England had literally allowed the borderers to get away with murder. It was a cheap way of guarding the frontiers of their lands. But now that James ruled both kingdoms, he wanted to get rid of the main troublemakers. Ulster was the ideal spot to send some of the most notorious borderers.
By exiling troublesome borderers to Ulster, King James solved two problems at once. First, he brought a measure of stability along the border between England and Scotland. And second, he introduced a free defense army into his fledgling colony in Ulster.
The borderers were excellent as plantationers because of their reputation for fighting, violence, military endeavour and resistance. That had been their function for several centuries, after all, against the English.
Descendants of these wildest of Scottish tribes would one day make a huge impression in America. Men like President Richard Nixon and Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. But first, they and all the other Scots involved in the plantation would have to survive the unknown world of Catholic Ulster.
People of faith, farmers and fighters, the families that were crossing these waters into Ulster brought a unique cultural heritage with them. A heritage that emphasized self-sufficiency and independence, loyalty to clan, and a strong new form of Christianity that preached that all people were equal in the eyes of God.
They had no ability to predict what lay ahead, but their decision would change the world as we know it. In the early 1600s, these waters were full of small boats ferrying Scots across to their new lives in Ireland's northern province, Ulster.
I've often thought of what it would have been like for so many of my ancestors to have crossed this very stretch of water back in the 1600s. First, they would have been traveling in groups of families, bringing their heritage with them. Some would have been bringing livestock. Others would have been bringing tools, individual weapons to defend their families, and of course, a Bible.
From these simple beginnings, a new people would be born, the Ulster-Scots, or as they're called in America, the Scots-Irish.
The fact that so many of the Scots who came to Ulster came in family groups, or that there was both women and men evenly balanced, means that over the longer term, the evidence would suggest more limited intermarriage. So the communities of Scots' presence in Ulster remain quite strong and tight in terms of their identity and their sense of community.
Establishing new lives would be a challenge.
This migration was vastly different than others that had characterized the ebb and flow across these waterways through the centuries. The Irish were furious at having been dispossessed of their lands, just as the Scots would have been if the situation had been reversed. At the same time, the Crown and the Church of England were constructing a hierarchy in Ulster that would consciously exclude the Scots. But they had made their decision, and there was no turning back.
This new hierarchy was based on religious identity. At the top, the members of the King's Protestant Church, the Episcopalians. Then came the Presbyterians, and finally the Catholics. Broadly speaking, English, then Scots, then Irish. In years to come, this layered society would make Ulster's green fields bleed red. But for the moment, the settlers were concentrating on building new lives. It quickly became obvious that the Scots hadn't lost their independent spirit.
A lot of the new settlers reached the land they'd been assigned to and decided they didn't want to live there. So they picked up their things and moved to a different spot, uninvited. 100 years later, their descendants would show the same anti-authoritarian defiance in America.
As on the American frontier, the movement of the Scots into areas that suited them had major implications for the way Ulster developed. Above all, it ensured that the new farming communities usually retained their distinctive cultural heritage.
I think the Scottish and English settlers tended not to interact very much. So Kilrain, for example, tended to be more English, Derry tended to be more Scottish.
Just as they had in their homeland, Ulster's new Scottish communities lived by the mottos of work hard, pray hard, play hard.
In 1610, the Reformation had certainly taken hold in Scotland, but it hadn't stamped all the joy and drinking out of the Scottish people, and they certainly will have imported this with them. Religion is central to their life, but it won't have stopped them drinking and partying.
The Scots did their best to transplant their ways of life into Ulster wholesale. But the uneasy relationships among the English, the Scots, and the Irish meant daily life could never be as orderly as King James's plans predicted. And always there was a threat that frictions could explode into something more. The church here at Temple Corran was the first the Scots built in Ulster in 1613.
This old church tells us a lot about the early Scottish settlers. Religion was so important that the church was one of the first buildings to be erected. And these gun portals show us what was usually second on their mind.
Of course there was going to be trouble. Nobody in their right mind is ever going to expect that the local population is going to say, welcome, in you come, there's my farm, take it. That's not going to happen.
For security, each plantation community built a central, fortified building, like the church or this castle in Newton Stewart, where settlers could rally in case of attack. Within just a few decades, these buildings would mean the difference between life and death for the settlers and for the entire plantation scheme. To understand why the settlers' dreams went sour so quickly, we need to return to John Knox's old preaching ground of Edinburgh. Here, in 1637, the new king, Charles I, was trying to change the Scottish church.
In 1637, Charles wants to introduce his way of running the church in Scotland, and the Scottish Presbyterians really didn't like it. They saw Charles's innovations as suspiciously Anglicised and suspiciously, dangerously Catholic.
Charles wanted bishops in government and an English-style prayer book. For Scottish Presbyterians, these policies threatened their independence. The country erupted in protest.
By 1638, the Scottish Protestants had been worshiping God in their own way for nearly a century. They were outraged at the king's attempt to force the bishops on them. It violated the core democratic principles of their faith. No one stood between them and their God, and no one was going to change that, not even a king. This kirkyard or churchyard at Greyfriars in Edinburgh was packed as people came from all around to protest the king's decision. They signed a compact against it, many writing their names in blood. Some wore red kerchiefs around their necks, not the last time that rebellious independent Scots would be called rednecks.
The originals of Scotland's national covenant are now fragile, kept in secure facilities. It's incredibly moving to look at this document, to realize after 400 years, you can hardly read the names of the people who signed it. But they were all ordinary Scots, perhaps the ancestors of Dolly Parton or Mark Twain or even my own. The thousands who signed documents like this one was an indicator of the power of this Protestant faith and its impact on the evolution of modern democracy. If an edict came from above and the people disagreed with it, they were going to rebel. Unexpectedly, this Scottish show of defiance unleashed a devastating whirlwind of consequences in Ulster. King Charles worried that Ulster's Presbyterians would unite with their Scottish brethren and rebel. So he demanded that they sign a declaration of their loyalty, which became known as the Black Oath.
The Black Oath meant that the Scots of Ulster were required to renounce and reject the Scottish National Covenant, and this was a Crown policy of trying to control and contain the Scots of Ulster.
And the Black Oath became known as the Black Oath because it really suggested Scots are not trusted as part of the British project.
Most Ulster-Scots refused to sign. Ireland crackled with rumors that the king would send in soldiers. By October 1641, Ulster was in turmoil, and native Irish leaders decided that the time was ripe for rebellion. Their uprising soon became a massacre.
The reports coming back from Ireland speak of Protestant babies being dashed against the walls, their brains bashed out. It's a very bloody picture.
Modern estimates suggest some 4,000 English and Scottish settlers were murdered. Another 8,000 died when they were forced into the wilderness to starve. And up to 4,000 Irish were also killed.
The plantation community seemed genuinely stunned by the 1641 attacks. As one settler later put it, "It was conceived among us, and yet we never felt it kick in the womb, nor struggle in the birth."
The attacks rubbed Ulster raw.
The events of 1641 poisoned relationships among English, Irish, and Scots in Ireland for generations. Ireland became a succession of bloody battlefields. Less than 10 years later, Oliver Cromwell conducted a slash and burn campaign throughout Ireland that resulted in the deaths of more than 500,000 Irish. The plantation honeymoon, if it had ever existed, was over.
Many people in Northern Ireland believe their recent troubles stemmed from these turbulent years. The divisions marked out so long ago are still with Ulster today. Northern Ireland's summer marching season sees the country's streets taken over by bands and bunting. The marchers celebrate the late 17th century war between Catholic King James II and Protestant King William of Orange, who had ousted James from the British throne. For the Scots-Irish, this war marked a defining moment in their history. King James thought Ireland, which was overwhelmingly Catholic, was the best place to fight to retrieve his crown. And most of Ireland, including Ulster, did quickly fall to James, until his troops reached the Scots-Irish stronghold of Derry.
In Derry, the Presbyterians, Scottish network are dominant, so it is not surprising Scots will draw in and come into these areas. Derry can be seen as a Scottish town in Ireland.
Local Protestants gathered behind Derry's walls, then closed the gates against James's troops. The Scots had battled under William Wallace for independence, under John Knox for equality, and they would fight just as hard here in Derry for their view of freedom. On April 18, 1689, King James demanded to be let into the city. Their answer was no surrender.
The Ulster-Scottish Presbyterians are determined to go all the way, which means that they will not surrender for quarter and will expect no quarter if they are besieged. So therefore it is a fight to the death.
For the two kings, Derry was simply another battlefield in their international war. But for the people inside the city's walls, it was a battle for civil and religious freedom. And as their descendants would later show in America, they were willing to die for this. For weeks, there was a constant exchange of fire from both sides. Within the city, food and resources ran low. Then on June 7th, an English ship, the Greyhound, came into sight, carrying food, soldiers, and the possibility of ending the siege. The city rejoiced. But the joy of Derry's defenders turned to dismay. After facing cannon fire, the ship turned away. For 6 weeks, the English Navy camped not far from Derry while people continued to die. Besieged by the Irish, abandoned by the English, the defenders inside the walls fought on. Hunger stalked both forces. Derry's defenders ate rats and stray dogs to survive. By midsummer 1689, the loss of life was terrible. More than 7,000 lay dead inside the city and another 8,000 outside the walls. At the end of July, King William finally ordered the English ships to break the siege. The fierce Ulster-Scots resolve had held Derry for the British crown and helped William to his eventual victory at the Battle of the Boyne.
Here is the Ulster-Scots standing against international forces. And this small town, relatively, has stood against it. So it's like, it is almost like David has defeated Goliath again.
The siege is still celebrated in Derry today, which can make Derry's walls seem as divisive as they were in the 17th century. But for the Scots-Irish in 1689, Derry was a triumph, coupled with a painful lesson from having been left to die by the English.
I have many ancestors who endured the siege at Derry and in time left Ireland for America. In the early years, the siege burned in their memories, as evidenced by letters that I still keep. As the generations passed, those memories faded, but not the motivation that had compelled them to resist. No surrender has been in the Scots-Irish DNA since the time of Hadrian's Wall. It was there before Derry. It sustained them on the American frontier, and it is with us still.
The Scots-Irish soon needed every bit of this resolve, because Derry's costly victory was about to turn very sour. And the Scots-Irish would decide to face a new wilderness in America. In the 1689 siege of Derry, Scots-Irish Presbyterians stood alongside English Episcopalians against a Catholic king. It didn't take long for this Protestant marriage of convenience to collapse.
The running of Ireland from 1690 becomes an English endeavour. Scots are totally marginalised. They're marginalised in civil government, both nationally and locally. They're marginalised in religious terms.
The liberties they'd struggled so hard to win were quickly denied them.
The siege of Derry and its disappointing aftermath left an indelible stamp on the Ulster-Scots. It marked them as an independent, democratic, combative culture that made its own rules when it came to political alliances.
The Scots-Irish decided to increase the strength of their own communities, and in the 1690s, up to 50,000 new arrivals came from Scotland.
The 1690s migration is the biggie. This is the biggest migration that takes place between Scotland and Ulster by a long shot.
Most of the new arrivals were yeoman farmers and entrepreneurs who saw Ulster as a land of opportunity. But the increased strength of the Scots-Irish communities worried the government in England. In 1704, the new English Queen Anne passed legislation known as the Penal Laws, designed to subdue the Scottish surge and required that all office holders in Ireland be Episcopalian. Scotch-Irish leaders lost their jobs. Their Presbyterian ministers weren't recognized. Even their marriages were declared illegal.
This was a full-scale political and ideological attack by the Church of Ireland to sort these Presbyterians out.
At the end of the day, the penal laws effectively made the Ulster Presbyterians feel like second-class citizens.
Once again, an act designed to crush the Scots-Irish ignited their defiance. They would stay true to their heritage.
Many of today's Ulster-Scots might consider themselves to be loyal to the crown, but their 18th century ancestors definitely did not. They were proud to call themselves the Northern Dissenters, with the emphasis firmly on the concept of dissent.
If the English government wasn't going to let them live freely in Ulster, then they would take their labor and their values elsewhere. And they'd all heard of the promised land across the sea, America. The flood out of Ulster was kick-started by a Presbyterian congregation from Achadui, a district to the east of Londonderry. They were led by the Reverend James MacGregor, who had fought for religious freedom as a boy at Derry.
Certainly in that early part of the 18th century, amongst those groups who go as congregations, the sense that they were going to somewhere where they could exercise their own religious liberty, have space and freedom in religious terms, was certainly part of the attraction of the New World.
This early exodus also represented economic opportunity. The Reverend MacGregor hadn't been paid for 3 years, and America offered the chance to look after both body and soul.
Brethren, let us be free. We are God's own people, and he shall divide the ocean before us.
About 700 people gathered on the docks of Coleraine and here in Derry to join MacGregor on his trip to America. Some were motivated by religion. Others believed they were going to strike it rich. Others had simply had it with the constant turmoil here in Ulster. But all of them were carrying their Ulster-Scots tradition with them, and each of them had just agreed to take a one-way trip to the wilderness of America.
Their journey was grueling, but coming from the villages of Ulster, hardship was nothing new. When they arrived, MacGregor and his congregation traveled into the wilderness to found their community, which they called Londonderry. Londonderry was the first exclusively Scots-Irish community in America, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next 50 years, hundreds of thousands of Scots-Irish would follow, most of them pouring through the mountains south in pursuit of an American dream. And their arrival made America the land we know today. Their willingness to fight helped the United States win the War of Independence. Their daring spirit helped open up the frontiers. And the music, drinks, and prayers they carried with them became the lifeblood of America. The Scots had become a new culture in the crucible of Ulster. Now, as the Scots-Irish, they were about to transform America.